On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Clarence Chio. He is the co-founder and CTO at Unit 21. We're going to be talking about what it means to be a good engineering leader. And in the case of Clarence, he has a really unique path. He went from being a lead IC to running his own company as a CTO, and he's gone through an amazing journey of skills he's had to pick up, lessons learned, dealing with scaling teams, and I think he's got a great background to talk about this in a unique viewpoint. So Clarence, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Amir. It's been a great journey so far with Unit 21, and definitely the theme is trial by fire. So I'd love to dive into that.
Absolutely. I guess just to start off, help us understand what Unit 21 does.
Unit 21 is a no-code platform for risk and compliance. We help fintech companies to detect fraud and money laundering without them having to involve engineers. And this problem is something that we faced in our last companies. And we saw that there were teams of operators that were dealing with fraud and compliance problems that had to rely on engineering teams to do their job. And we didn't think this was right or efficient. So our tool allows these teams to be fully self-sufficient without having to rely on knowing how to write code, knowing how to write SQL, and they can just use our product to hit the ground running.
Awesome. I guess to kind of start at the top level, we had talked about previously, you came into your current role, co-founder, CTO, without, being a director of engineering or VP of engineering. You came in as a senior or lead IC type of role. Talk to us a little bit about the experience you had before you took the job, just to understand some of that.
Yeah, it was definitely a very different experience. I had never managed a big team before. I had managed a small team of people, and it was definitely very different from what we're doing today. Today, Unit 21 is 140 people, and we have over 80 engineers on our team. Before Unit 21, I was in a company called Shape Security. And back then, I really wanted to start my own company. I couldn't because of visa reasons. But I wanted to build up the skill sets that I thought in my mind at that time was most necessary to develop what I needed to know in order to run my own company. So very naively, I thought I needed to know how to build stuff and I needed to know how to sell stuff. So I tried to go into customer-facing roles. I tried to do some sales engineering, talk to customers, be on calls, and to get exposure to that side of things. I never really realized that a big part of growing and scaling a company was knowing how to manage people well and to lead through influence rather than to just lead by building things better yourself. So I'd say it's been a learning journey. The first part of building Unit 21, I think it's not that different from being part of a small project group or being part of a small engineering team, because the team will be small as you're trying to figure out product market fit. And I think that phase was really natural to me because I had done similar things in my past jobs before. And even though there's this like head of engineering title or CTO title, it really didn't mean anything. This is just outward facing. This is whatever the customers needed to see in order to take you seriously. But internally, it was just exactly the same thing. You were just galvanizing a group of 5 to 6 people to build this one thing, and you had to move fast and find the things that worked. But when we needed to scale, when we needed to spend most of my time hiring, then I realized that was when I needed to step up and actually figure out how to do this thing.
Interesting. I guess, I could see the analogy of, if you're in a smaller team and you're, responsible for some features and you're delivering, being a co-founder with a smaller team of, a couple of engineers, I could see the analogies. And at some point there's a, tipping of the scales of when you need to maybe shift your focus. I guess if you were to go back and kind of think through, the actual time as you're going through this and you're like, you know what, I'm delivering, but now I need to alter my focus to helping the team grow, giving them the responsibility and me taking a step back from the builder hat. How did that realization come about? Like, was it pretty obvious? Was it a little bit of clunkiness going through to figure that out?
Definitely. I think it usually starts being very gradual where you feel like, everyone says that maybe you shouldn't be spending all your time coding or spending most of your time coding. You should be going out there hiring or figuring out, talking to customers and things like that. But then I think there usually comes a point whereby if things work and if some big customers come on board and you have to suddenly realize that you and your existing team can't possibly do what you need to get done, then the realization that, okay, I need to actually be spending 80% of my time hiring and talking to people and figuring out how to scale this team by 3x in the next 6 months, rather than trying to figure out the best architecture for this thing. And for me, it came when we signed our first big logos and realized that we had to increase our transaction volumes that we were processing by 20,000 times. And that was the point where we realized that, okay, 5-person team isn't going to cut this. We're going to have to put a lot more effort behind this. And who else is going to do this? So even though I really liked coding, I really liked building, I think most engineers do. Most people that transition into engineering leadership roles also came from that kind of background. I think it's a realization that the biggest contribution that you can have to the team isn't to write better code or even isn't to be directly involved with architectural decisions all the time, but to, number one, nurture the people that can do those things for you so that you can be freed up to do other things, whatever it may be at that time. That's the most useful thing you can do.
And that's interesting. Like giving up that building hat with, some deliberate, thought, some intentionality. I guess two things come to mind within that context. One is you obviously have come to the realization you need more people. The second is, do you have somebody to offload the technical work that you were already doing? So that seems like a bit of a dilemma, right? You have to have, the team to offload that. They have to have the bandwidth, but yet you need to go build processes to actually hire and get good at hiring, which is not easy. Hiring is one of the hardest things to do, I think, for most people. But when you were kind of going through that process of going, I need to offload some of the work and I need to go hire, was it just super long days at that point? Or were you like, hey, I have this internal resources, they're just going to pick up the slack because I need them to?
That's a really good question. There were definitely a lot of long days, but I think a lot of the long days were caused more by me not realizing how to let go earlier rather than not having the right team to let go to. I had a really strong team. Like we still have a really strong team. All of our early engineers are still here, part of the team today. And I think that was really the thing that allowed me to eventually say that I can trust these people to run the ship while I go out there and try to staff this with more people. I can trust them to make the right decisions. And even though it's not exactly the same decisions that I would make, but when I come back and take a look at it 6 months down the road, I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. And that's a really hard thing, I think, to realize initially, because this stuff, especially for entrepreneurs, especially for people that have built this since day one, this is your baby. And this is hard to say, hey, just take care of this baby for me. I'm going to leave the house for a while. But I think the earlier entrepreneurs are able to figure this out, the better they're going to be able to scale and the more empowered their teams are going to be able to feel to take this to the next level.
Absolutely. Interesting. And I guess, it's interesting that you mentioned, realizing letting go earlier. So obviously your focus is kind of shifting at that point. You're really, becoming more in tune with the organizational need. You're kind of removing yourself as that potential bottleneck and you turn your attention to solving some of those problems. Now, when you look back on your own journey, were you looking back at previous companies and some of the processes they ran? Were you looking at, hey, we're too small. I've got to figure out how to put together the right process for my company at this time. I mean, where were you drawing on experience? I guess you hadn't scaled the company before, and that was kind of some of the pains you're going through.
So I never scaled a company before, but I've been part of engineering teams in the past where I saw good and bad things. And I don't think there is a single universal truth for what is a good process, what is a bad process. Everything is quite circumstantial based on the business you're in, the kind of requirements of growth, and the type of people that you have on board. So at Unit 21, we really believe that process is fundamentally evil, but it is in many cases a necessary evil. So we try to only instill processes when we think that we are getting diminishing returns from keeping things free and open and flat. And so we do a lot of things that maybe can seem a little bit chaotic for a company at our size. But I and our team really believe that this chaos breeds a lot of enablement from people that maybe would have voices silenced or maybe would have a much harder time getting their opinions and thoughts surfaced. And I think this is what helps startups differentiate from a lot of larger companies. Like once you start instilling a bunch of process, and once you start being in control over how ideas get elevated and how you build things, then I think things really start to grind to a halt. Things really slow down. And we try not to do any of that. I think there's going to be plenty of time to do that when we get a lot larger and when we have things a lot more figured out. But we really value the resistance to building huge processes. And we still do a lot of the standard stuff. So we still have agile cycles for development. We still run sprints and we still have our proper Scrum methodology. But we do so not as a religion. We do so not to go through the cycles and the actions. but because it actually helps make us more agile and better. And I think being aware of that, especially in a smaller company environment, is really important to velocity.
And I guess that's interesting from the standpoint of, as you're looking back, you guys are a bigger company now than, going through some of the initial growth stages of, being a smaller team. When you're looking at the maturation, are you seeing this play out pretty consistently for the organization? Meaning, I like how you said, observing the law of diminishing returns that, as you're looking at processes and don't add unless it's happening. Have you seen that as a pretty consistent pattern as the company has been just maturing?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty consistent pattern. There's one thing that I think doesn't naturally move towards this realization, and that's related to team topologies. There were several points in the development journey where I realized that the natural way that teams develop isn't better organization. It's generally more and more chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And there needs to be some kind of guiding hands to move teams towards a state that better enables them to move fast while being focused. So I talked to a lot of people, learned a lot from mentors and people that have done this a few times before about how to best structure teams to optimize between velocity and throughput. It's a very intricate balance that, once again, there's no right answer for. Depends on what kind of team you have and what you're trying to do. But that kind of thing, I think, tends to be very circumstantial and depends on what you want to do with it.
Yeah, I think it also depends, as your company grows, each team will have its own velocity and obviously its own predicted output. And I think something you mentioned just in terms of mentors, and I was kind of curious, you have a unique entry into being a CTO, as we kind of talked about. As you were going through the process of growing your skills as a leader, how did you go about learning? I mean, was it all trial by fire? Were you turning to mentors? Like, how were you helping yourself kind of upskill to kind of keep pace with the pace of the organization itself?
There was definitely a lot of trial by fire, especially early on when I didn't know how to ask for help. And over time, I talked to a lot of mentors, I talked to a lot of advisors and people that have done this before. And I found that eventually all advice kind of cancels out to zero because people are telling you all things on all parts of the spectrum that really you have to decide what is right for you. So eventually I realized that these conversations weren't really leading me to a better realization of what I should do, but giving me a data point on what worked in that circumstance and what didn't work in this other circumstance. So what really helped me though was in the middle finding a support group, like peer group of people in several, interesting similar stages of company building that I could lean on to ask for advice. And we would really kind of just beat each other's brain trust in figuring out how to solve these problems. And I still do that today with a group of people. They're all CTOs in companies that are around the same size as us, same stage of growth. And it's really interesting to see how everyone's problems are the same when we're in the group. But when we're out of the group, no one we talk to ever has the same kinds of problems because it's very rare to find a group of people that are in the same stage of company building that face the same types of challenges that we do. So that was super, super helpful for me. And we ask this group of people random questions all the time. And they either say, I faced this 6 months ago, or I think I'm going to face this in 6 months. What should I do?
It is an interesting aspect of when you ask people that have already gone through things, their point of context is very different than when you're dealing with people who they're either going through it or freshly having dealt with something. It's just something about that hindsight where we tend to forget some of those nuances of why we made decisions when we did. When you're looking at the company moving forward now, obviously you guys want to grow, get bigger. Do you envision yourself kind of sticking to that? Like, I guess the peer groups have been really supportive as you try to scale to 200, 300, 400 people. Do you think that's going to be still a viable solution for you and how you like to learn?
Yeah. For however long it's useful to me or useful to the other people in the peer group, I'll keep doing it. I think it's naturally going to become more and more lonely in the journey as time goes on. And, I found that it was really a lonely process in the early entrepreneurial journey when you're trying to find what to do. And it was also a group of people around me in an entrepreneurial community that helped me to find that, hey, I'm on this journey alone, but there's many people on these lonely journeys alongside me. And that was helpful to know. So I think a lot of the time it's just finding that comfort within yourself, that psychological feeling that even though it feels lonely, there's there are solving the same kinds of problems and are also feeling similarly lonely. And that somehow makes you feel better about things.
Absolutely. If you were to go back to your pre-entrepreneur self, and I guess the reason I'm asking is there's probably a lot of people who are in positions where they're like, I'm going to go start my own business, or I want to go do X, Y, and Z. And once you step into it, you don't know until you're walking down that path. But if you were to be able to go back to that, your younger self, and be like, hey, listen, these are a couple of things you need to know going into this. Obviously, being lonely, a lonely journey is one of them. Are there any tidbits or advice that you'd have to that younger Clarence?
Well, that's a great question. I think the piece of advice would probably be to take your time to figure out what is it that you want to do. We at Unit 21 definitely stumbled in the early days on trying to find the thing that we want to do, because there's always a lot of pressure in finding the startup to start, especially when in the exploration phase. I think people that come from tech, people that work as software engineers or in the Valley, always have this constant pressure to achieve and to overachieve. But in starting a company, I think most companies, if they go well, are multiple year, if not decade-long journeys. And why rush to find something to start in 3 months when you can spend 3 additional months to figure out if this is actually the right thing that you want to spend your life on? That's the thing that I didn't realize early on. We were rushing the things. And when we actually took a step back to think, what is it that I want to be spending the next 10 years of my life on? Then we found Unit 21, and that was a realization.
That's interesting. I think a lot of people talk about that macro vision. And I think, it's one thing to have an idea and go, this is what I want to do, but then to actually flesh it out. And like you said, a lot of startups do stumble and kind of accidentally maybe find their way. And then somebody like you who, the advice is maybe take a little bit longer time, because it does take a lot of effort to backtrack and go back and fix. You have a super interesting background. When we first talked before, I obviously had mentioned you hadn't done this, but it sounds like the journey itself, now that you're looking back on it, you've got this, great amount of skill. You're part of, peer groups. I guess if you're going to look forward, right, and you're looking at the time when, the companies, let's say, you guys are successful and you're bigger, is there a time that you envision that you're like, hey, I need to actually, find a different role in the company for myself? Can you envision that happening and be like, I'm going to, work in different, because obviously you're the CTO hats right now in your head, you're a co-founder, but can you envision the day that maybe you're like, hey, I'm better used to the company doing something different?
Absolutely. I think always I'm a co-founder first and a CTO second. And whatever it is that the company needs at any point in time, I will do. So I think this day will come. I think this day will come where I realize that my contributions to the company are best applied in some other way rather than leading the engineering team or doing this specific thing. And when we find the right person, I think this is absolutely the thing we do. I think that the role of founders in companies isn't to try to do every job the best that we can do, because it's impossible to be a CEO or a CTO or a COO and be good at everything. Very few people have that kind of ability to learn and grow alongside, and it may not be the best thing for the company. I think true nature of the jobs of founders are to find experts and grow and nurture experts who actually have done the job before and actually know how to run these functions and bring them to the extremities of efficiency and effectiveness, and then let them take the reins. And the founders that have really been effective and able to do this truly build long-lasting generational companies, and we want to do that.
Awesome, man. Super great story. Like, I think it's inspirational. I think your view of not your journey here, but your view of where you're going to go, your vision of your role within the company is awesome. And I wish you the best luck. Thanks for coming on and sharing. I know you're busy, so I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. If somebody wants to get a hold of you to touch on anything, what's a good way of doing that? Is LinkedIn, other social media, email?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. Also, my email is clarence@unit21.ai.
Okay. Awesome, man. We'll include those in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on and being a part of the show.
Thank you, Amir.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, I always ask for 2 things. One, if you enjoyed the show, share it with somebody else. That's how we've grown. It's all organic. So I appreciate everyone who always shares the show. And secondly, if there's a topic you want me to address, feel free to let me know. I'll do my best to find a guest to do that. Until next time, thank you. Goodbye.